Good evening, everybody. As you can tell, I'm not Dean Tyrus Miller. He was called for jury duty today, so I'm stepping in to perform the role of introducing the program. My name is Judy Wu, and I'm the faculty director of the UCI Humanities Center. I want to thank our speakers, some of whom I've been in contact with for almost a year. And I also want to acknowledge our co-sponsors and core organizers who have assisted in this effort to bring together this program since last year. And they are the Latinx Student Resource Center, the UCI Dream Center, the Department of Chicano and Latino Studies, the Forum for the Academy and the Public, UCI Illuminations, and Literary Journalism Center for Storytelling. We initially invited Juan Gonzalez and Aarti Shahani to participate in the spring quarter signature program. Since I became the faculty director of the UCI Humanities Center, we've been foregrounding the public significance of the humanities. We adopted the phrase conversations that matter to underscore how humanities scholarship engages with pressing political concerns. Last year, we focused on the theme of borders and belonging, and this topic was very much in response to the separation of refugee children from their families at US borders, as well as the broader debates of who belongs and who decides. These questions, unfortunately, are still very much with us. I was particularly interested in inviting Juan Gonzalez, a pioneering journalist and activist with roots extending back to the Brown Berets and currently co-host of Democracy Now! He's the Richard D. Hefner Professor of Communications and Public Policy and the Professor of Professional Practice in the Department of Journalism and Media Studies at Rutgers University. He's also the author of 5 books, including Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, and News for All the People, the epic story of race and American media. We envisioned holding this event in Santa Ana, a majority Latinx community adjacent to UCI, to signal our interest in university community collaboration and conversation. I'm so grateful that Aarti Shahani also agreed to join our conversation. She's a prize-winning author and contributor to NPR. She published her memoir, Here We Are, American Dreams, American Nightmares. And I want to thank especially Professor Vijay Gurbashani, the director of the Center of Digital Transformation at UCI, for introducing Ms. Shahani to me. And today, I'm so grateful that they are joined by Ms. Anh Do. As many of you know, Orange County is home to the largest Vietnamese community outside of Vietnam. And Anne's journalistic roots include, and I apologize for the pronunciation, Noi Viet Daily News, NVD Daily News, which is the oldest and largest circulating publication serving the diasporic Vietnamese community. She has since worked with newspapers in Texas and Washington State, and also reported from Cuba, India, Mexico, Peru, and Vietnam. She's currently with the Los Angeles Times. And I had the pleasure of hearing her speak about the responsibility of journalists and ethnic newspapers for a series on anti-Blackness in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community this summer. I want to thank my colleagues, Tiffany Willoughby-Herard, Associate Professor of African American Studies, and Felix Jean-Louis III, ACLS Emerging Voices Fellow based at UCI in the Department of European Languages and Culture, in joining this panel. Professor Willoughby-Herard works on comparative racialization in South African and North American contexts, Black political thought, and African feminisms. She's the author of Challenging the Legacies of Racial Resentment, Black health activism, educational justice, and legislative leadership in the waste of a white skin, Carnegie and the racial logic of white vulnerability. Professor Jean-Louis is a historian of the African diaspora with a particular focus on Caribbean and African-American realities. His dissertation, Between Harlem and Paris, Haitian Internationalism in the Interwar Period, 1918 to 1938, explores the roles of Haitians in various projects to forge a unified community of people of African descent, committed to upending colonialism and in opposition to white supremacist domination. I very much look forward to the reflections, questions, and conversations that they will have with this esteemed panel of journalists. I believe we all have a sense that we're living through historic times. The year 2020 will be recognized as a time when life was fundamentally transformed. COVID-19 literally placed our lives in suspension as we quarantined and sheltered in place. The deaths that resulted from the pandemic and the lack of coordinated public health efforts have touched many of our lives. My own father passed away this last spring, not due to COVID-19, but his death was nevertheless fundamentally shaped by the fears of contagion which prevented my mother and I from visiting him. Some of the experiences of 2020 were not drastic transformations, but the deepening of existing racial and economic hierarchies. We are witnessing today the renewed visibility of racial hatred and violence, as well as the presumptions and assertions of class and white privilege. 2020 also was the year that the United States elected its first woman, first multiracial African-American, South Asian American vice president, and the election of the first African-American senator from the state of Georgia. So I welcome all of you and our speakers and conversation partners in helping us process what we are collectively experiencing and serving. I'd like to begin by asking Juan, Aarti, and Anne to begin with some opening comments about what they perceive to be the most important developments of 2020. And then I will turn this over to Professor Willoughby-Herard and Jean-Louis to engage in conversation with them. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the Q&A function, and we will turn to those questions as the program proceeds. Thank you very much. Juan, would you like to go ahead?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I didn't know what order people wanted to do with it. Well, I think if you're asking what are the main events that have shaped the past year, it seems to me would have to be on the one hand the COVID pandemic, which has clearly demonstrated across the world the failure of many governments across the world, but particularly of the United States, to adequately prepare and deal with public health issues in a preventive way. And so I think the failures around the existence of the rise of the pandemic, the failures of our government in dealing with it has to be one. The other has to be the enormous uprisings of the people's uprisings.
I wasn't supposed to be on this.
Hello? I'm sorry. The other would have to be the enormous public uprisings that developed in the wake of George Floyd's death and the movement of Black Lives Matter from a radical, apparently for most of American society, a gadfly movement, suddenly becoming a mainstream movement and challenging once again how America has dealt with racial justice throughout its history. And then finally, the election and the defeat of Donald Trump, of a neo-fascist political movement. It's been temporarily defeated, but certainly it's really only still gaining strength, unfortunately. So I would think those are the three things: COVID, the resurgence and the power of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the presidential election.
I can go next, please. So in reviewing 2020, I thought that the major stories were seismic, repeating and describing in my own terms some of the things that Juan mentioned. There was a pandemic that stopped and changed the world. There was protesting against racial injustice, sparked by the death of George Floyd, with the actions erupting across not just our country, but globally. There was a presidential election conducted online, featuring the largest number of voters in US history, more than 161 million, and with an incumbent refusing to accept defeat and gasp, still trying to overturn those results. So through it all, the media served as narrator, adapting again and again as news and access to that news force us to change the way that we do our jobs every day. And I thank everyone for their time tonight. And I hope that we can discuss the media's role, as well as allow me a chance to learn from you through the scientific and political lens.
I would just jump in and to really echo what Juan and Anh have already said. I mean, I agree with those three major stories as really shaping how I will forever remember 2020. I think that part of then, the challenge of that year is there kept being these moments that I wanted to be very inspired and motivated by. I would say, for example, certainly not the execution, but the mass conscious response that you're seeing from people, this willingness to talk about racism as a fact and not as a taboo. I mean, these are things that I was frankly surprised in a good way to see. I did not expect, and there were these, these kind of flip, clearly commercial, business-driven things. Like, I kind of looked at the official NFL statement that way. But really, there was a deeper shift, I think, in American consciousness, one that I have not seen since the September 11th, 2001. I think of 2020 in a lot of ways as having pushed back on some of the characteristics of American culture that became really hardened after the 9/11 attacks. And, we can talk more about that later. And I would say that I can even say this as a creative, having written a memoir about my family's immigrant journey, the 30-year campaign to make America home. It was interesting to me to see among my South Asian American readers, which is a sizable portion of the response I got to the book, how I saw in the South Asian community a real interest, I would say, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, a real interest in working class Desi South Asian stories. People maybe less intrigued by the story of the Indians who go to medical school, and more intrigued by the story of the Indians who, in my case, in my family, went to Rikers Island, a story I write about in Here We Are. And so I would say that it's been interesting for me because even people like quote unquote liberal who, for years and years and years, I've kind of become accustomed to having very little class consciousness, very little understanding of institutionalized racism, but still by category, quote unquote, liberal. I really saw a change in 2020. I mean, remotely, another huge change I would say for that year is our move into a digital world, right? The fact that we're having this event as we are, the fact that some schools, certainly not all, went on to virtual classrooms with varying degrees of success, the fact that remote work is happening. I think in a lot of ways, in addition to the politics that has played out in the year, what's wild to me is like literally the very way we communicate with each other has gone through a revolution that probably we've never seen before and may never see again. But it's wild when you think about that change in interpersonal, how we connect.
Yeah. I would say though that being, I guess, perhaps one of the older people on this panel, I want to urge folks not to be fooled by the change that is occurring now to think that it will be a permanent change. Because I remember back, for instance, after the uprisings of the 60s, the late 1960s, America went through a major ideological debate over racism back then. And I think it climaxed back when really the television networks dominated what everyone saw. There was no cable really back then, except in the outlying rural areas. In the big cities, there was no cable. So the networks dominated everything. And ABC, for an entire week, ran a miniseries of Roots based on Alex Haley's book. And it sparked an enormous conversation across the American public about the true history of racism in America. But I believe that that was actually the beginning of the counter-revolution. Those who began to be threatened by the fact that we were beginning to come to a reckoning with the history of the country in the past, then started mounting their counter-narrative and their counter-revolution. And my perspective is that we're in the midst of the third Reconstruction attempt. If we say the first Reconstruction was after the Civil War, the second attempt at Reconstruction was in the 60s, but that was beaten back by the right-wing reaction. We're now in a third attempt to reconstruct American society among more egalitarian terms, and it's by no means guaranteed that the consciousness that exists now will endure for 20, 30, 40, or 50 years. Because that's the problem with changing consciousness, is that if you don't change the structures of the society, people get old and a new generation comes in and you have to re-educate them all over again. So I think that it's wonderful what's happened in terms of developing consciousness among the American people, but we must not let our vigilance down and assume that change is bound to come as a result of this new sort of awakening of people on issues of race and racial injustice.
Well, I guess with that, I should start asking the questions, because the first question I think touches on some of this. And before I start, I wanted to thank the activist community, radio journalist, Black movement archivist, Elizabeth Robinson, Lynn Fujiwara, Steph Jones, Damian Sojourner, and Tommy Hayes, who helped shape some of these questions. And I think what the question I asked is going to touch on some of this. Throughout 2020, there was a rise in threats and actions by white supremacist groups that prompted the FBI and Homeland Security to pronounce them to be a threat to our government. How do you contextualize the permission for white militias knowing this to overtake state capitals, the national capitals, threaten to kill governors, intimidate voters, make credible threats of lynching to the vice president, especially given the militarized response? And do you think these white militias, Juan, like you were saying, are birthed out of this sort of return to conservatism after the 1970s that you mentioned?
Well, I don't know if that was directed at me. If somebody else wants to jump in, they're welcome to. But if I would say that that I think, look, we got to be clear. The United States is the most powerful country in the world, but it is a declining imperial power, and it's a declining imperial power which is being forced increasingly to take from its population as a polarization, economic polarization grows greater and greater. So there are many, many more people that are feeling pain in this country than were 20 years ago or 30 or 40 years ago. And so there is the potential for fascist movements to grow, and they have been growing, and I believe they will continue to grow, feeding off the discontent that has been increasing as a result of the economic privation that the American people are going through. We interviewed on Democracy Now! Walden Bellow, wonderful radical sociologist who tried to explain how he sees the development of this fascist movement, not only in this country, but around the world. And I think that what he said is we should not underestimate the potential for the growth of this fascist movement. And in fact, the ouster of Trump may actually embolden folks even more, because it's almost always in periods of democratic or liberal administrations that these fascist movements grow even bigger. Don't forget, Timothy McVeigh blew up the Oklahoma City Federal Building under the Clinton administration, right? And it was under the Clinton administration that these militias first grew, so that there's even potential for greater, more violence, I think, in terms of right-wing militias under this new Biden administration as we head forward.
I'd love to follow up, Juan, on that question. There's kind of a term we've been throwing around here in Irvine of like MAGA multiculturalism. You know, in the post-2009 era in California, as our community has emerged as a powerhouse of diversity, it's also cultivated a kind of misbegotten rainbow coalition of support for right-wing movements. And so you use the word fascism, And I think that's an apt word to be talking about. So how do we talk about people of color actively being engaged in right-wing movements in the US, like the Vietnamese people who were shown carrying South Vietnamese flags while storming the Capitol, or the presence of MAGA surrogates of color? You know, there's this fellow, Alexander, you know, who's been all over the news today in particular, claiming that he's, you know, going to take the fall for the Capitol. So what, if any, is the value of asking such a question and analyzing the phenomena from this perspective? Does it help us understand fascism in a different kind of way, or a new way, or is it something we should be paying closer attention to?
Yeah, well, I think actually, if you look at it, because this is the world's biggest imperial power, we become the base area for reactionaries around the world. When the Venezuelan revolution occurred, all the right-wing Venezuelans came to the United States. You know, when the Cuban Revolution occurred, all those who were against social change and revolution came to the United States. A lot of the people who fled from Vietnam after the fall of the Vietnamese government were largely those who were allied, the people who have been allied to the American forces. The initial migration, of course, the children changed, but the initial migration were those of who were part of the governing structure. We're going to see it in Afghanistan. Now, increasingly, as the United States pulls out of Afghanistan, the ruling circles who were tied to the United States forces will have to leave because they can no longer survive in that situation. So we become the area that gathers all the counter-revolutionaries of the world. And so therefore, even within the racial minority groups, the class struggle is still there. It exists within these groups. So anyone would be foolish to think that an entire nationality is going to think one way, or entire racial group is going to think one way. There are class struggles within every group, but those counter-revolutionaries are always a minority. They're always, they're not the majority of the people. And the issue is to be able to get to the majority of the people within each group, so that the Republicans are increasingly putting up people of color as candidates, because they know they can no longer continue to have just white candidates in a country that is changing so dramatically demographically. So they're going to find their own African Americans, their own Latinos, their own Chinese Americans, their own Vietnamese Americans to run on their platform. But we have to see that as a class struggle more than just a sort of an ethnic bonding of these different groups.
No, on that point, oh, please go ahead.
No.
Oh, thank you, Aarti. Building on what Juan just said, I think that coverage of the counter-revolutionaries and of the extremism that exists across our nation is so limited in the news today, partly because media companies are shrinking. The staff has shrunk hugely in the last 10 years and is continuing to shrink. And the beat structure of what we have covered, you know, race, ethnicity, culture, diversity, Black America, in my own company, Black Los Angeles, has been so restricted because we don't have the resources. You know, we have mostly focused on daily news, breaking news, and political news. And now, thanks to the pandemic, we're all coronavirus reporters in some way or another. Because we have lacked that coverage in recent years, there's no knowledge about the roots of those unrests and the solutions, if there are any, in specific regions.
You know, just what I think just a point that I'd like to make about this, the real ideological and political diversity in every racial group in this country. You know, I think the fact that it comes as a surprise to anyone, if and when it does, it's really just a failure of our newsrooms. I mean, I think that I want to give an example. Each of us, very likely, I would put money on it, at least certainly each of us on this presentation, we're probably sweating bullets in some way or had our stomach in a knot in some way at the night of November 3rd, wondering that night and then the next and then the next, okay, what's it going to be? Who won? And part of how I channeled my anxiety was I called a lot of people in Starr County, Texas. Now, Starr County, Texas is a practically entirely Latinx community on the border. And a lot of newsroom, and what happened is in 2016, they voted solidly for Hillary Clinton. And then in this election cycle, they swung solidly for President Trump. And interestingly, and not everyone picked this up who bothered to comment on it, they swung for President Trump, but then down ballot, they stayed Democrat. And I found it, frankly, obnoxious that so many news outlets were like, oh my God, can you believe that, in newsrooms, Hispanics, can you believe that Hispanics are voting for Trump? And I'm kind of like, well, sure I can. I mean, why wouldn't you believe it? For, reasons that I would say, Juan, you already mentioned, but then also, things like some people believe a border wall, and that was supposed to be the site for the border wall that Trump promised his constituency. Some people believe a border wall is really good for their real estate value. Some people living along that border, that town, are really afraid of the elimination of the oil industry and fossil fuels because it's the only jobs they have. So I just think that, America is this experiment in multi-ethnic democracy with a very, very, very ugly and troubled past as well as present. I mean, we're not ignorant to this. And I think that for us to see ourselves clearly, because I believe, fundamentally at a personal level and as a society, you progress by self-awareness, by true awareness of what is actually there. And so I think that, it's really on our newsrooms to stop being dumb. Just stop, it's time, You look at Netflix and you see the algorithms are giving me the most diverse content I could possibly want. And they're shifting how they do all their studios and productions and whatnot, because they understand that we want multi-ethnic culture constantly. Indian matchmaking, I'll give you an example, was a hit globally and in the US. And I would, again, put money down. I'm sure that more than one person on this talk saw it, binge watched it even. So I just, I don't know what it will take for us to get it together, but I would like people who were shocked that people of color are voting for Trump to be ashamed of that shock, because it really just means, okay, you're you're just stereotyping, just leave DC, talk to some people,
Yes, get back on the streets and go to talk to the rest of humanity, mingle with them.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, do you think that there is sort of a lack of diversity in the newsroom? And you were talking about that, and especially on this panel, we're missing journalists of African descent here, and some of the other sites of authoritarianism that has risen, has gone missing, like in Haiti and Brazil, maybe from some of the discourses because of the lack of these people. I know, Anne, you mentioned the shrinking newsrooms. Do you guys want to talk about how to amplify voices of Black journalists and also other journalists that would bring out some of these nuances that you were talking about?
Yes, thank you for that question, Felix. Echoing what Aarti said, it's not a surprise that people of color have all of these passions, political and otherwise. The reason we're not hearing them is because our workforce reporting on them do not reflect the communities in which we all live. We see that all across California, especially. And, at the LA Times, we had also our own summer of racial reckoning, and there were apologies publicized from the owner and from the editors on the lapsed coverage of communities of color and detailed step-by-step on how we can do better. This week, you know, we hired the first reporter in our history to cover Black Los Angeles. That's a new position.
Wow.
Yes, and another position which will be filled and announced soon, they've been interviewing for it for several months, is the minority healthcare reporter. And, you know, we have a brand new masthead position created called Assistant Managing Editor of Culture and Talent to help recruit world-class talent to the LA Times while working to retain the top staff that we currently are trying to nurture. You know, hopefully no one will go anywhere. We don't want to have that revolving door. I see a lot of other major publications as well as radio and television stations starting to step up. The George Floyd death has sparked a huge internal examination in newsrooms across America. And everyone from the New York Times to the Washington Post to smaller publications have listed jobs to cover an array of issues involving race, beyond healthcare, beyond politics, and just trying to balance the inequities that we see in day-to-day society and elevating those voices in our pages and starting to commit more to quoting people who have never been heard from. And I'm thrilled to see that.
Thank you so much for that response. And you use the word workforce, right? You know, from my vantage point, because I do international research, it would be so lovely if every section of a newspaper had a section on workforce, you know, like what are the conditions of the people who are working in. This takes me to this question about essential workers, because, you know, 2020, we've been talking about it as this hell that has to be forgotten in ways that actually are covering over all the race, class, and citizenship disparities that COVID-19 exposed, at least exposed for some people for the first time. You know, 2020's racial reckoning actually necessitated some really important and much needed reframing of racial terror and who is essential to society. And I guess my question is, how is it that not everybody in this country knew how many different types of work it takes to run a society? You know, we need morticians, we need drivers, we need supermarket employees, we need therapists, we need daycare workers. And what does this say about, you know, capitalism and our particular capitalist society, that we can't support the people that we actually need? We can't live without, we cannot survive without people who are doing these different categories of work, but we have no way to support them.
Aarti mentioned an excellent point earlier, and I noted it in my notebook here. She said that 2020 has led us to a real introduction and increase in the working class stories that, you know, more and more people are hearing about. And I say it's more than time to get focused even more in depth into their lives and their struggles. The reason we haven't had such a strong focus on that is because media traditionally has been so overwhelmingly covering institutions and corporations and like these so-called important places and people with elevated titles and the salaries in many cases to match. Whereas it's the ordinary person doing extraordinary things to hold up our lives day to day that really deserve more of a spotlight. And, you know, I have been fascinated to see what the Instacart shoppers are doing, what the pizza delivery guys and gals are doing, you know, what janitors in churches are doing. You know, janitors are not only just visible in our schools, What about drivers? And not just, you know, the person who is a nurse, but the person who stocks the supply cabinet in the OR. You know, all of these individuals have such important and crucial jobs that somehow we need to restructure our coverage, no matter what kind of news organization you're operating, to be able to highlight more of their world.
Well, if I can second that, and I think what it is basically our media system is built sort of on the great man theory of history, that it is the capitalist moguls, it is the political leaders, it's the celebrities that really drive what happens. When in reality, all societies depend on the combined work of millions and millions of people to make the society possible. And I think that it's been a problem consistently throughout the American press. And the reality is, for instance, there used to be, every newspaper used to have a labor reporter 30, 40 years ago. And then little by little, they pushed them over into the business. They created business sections, and they threw the labor reporters into the business section. And pretty soon the business sections felt, well, there's a new technology we have to cover, or a new branch of business we have to cover. So let's forget about this labor reporter, and we'll just deal with this new rising industry. And so little by little, there are no labor reporters left anywhere in America who's in major media companies. There are some alternative, and some radical or dissident publications that still have labor reporters, but no one is covering working class America on a regular basis. And so you have this dearth. Now everyone awakens that there are all these essential workers that are necessary for them to be able to stay home, because they're in white collar jobs and they're able to stay home and still get paid. But these other folks have to go to work every day, and they now increasingly depend on them to do more labor than before. So now suddenly we're paying attention. But I think it's probably, again, it's a structural and cultural mindset of the mass media that's been true throughout the history of the country.
I would just sort of note, having spent years as NPR Silicon Valley correspondent, and I think I can so clearly see that my first full-time job in journalism, which was that job, I think was absolutely the focus on Silicon Valley as this area of basically the place to celebrate American capitalism. It's interesting because I can recall coming into the beat around 2012, 2013, and that was the kind of the ethos across newsrooms. And then in 2016, when the Democratic Party was in search of a technological explanation for their political failure, suddenly there was an interest and an appetite to be critical of Facebook, Google, big tech in a way that hadn't happened before. But what I would just point out is that, I think it's great that we have journalists who are focusing on Silicon Valley. I think that we need more of them. And there are labor stories there. There are many labor stories there. So the reporting isn't necessarily treating them as such, but I'll give you the example. I think another huge development from 2020 was in California, the passage of Prop 22. So basically, what we saw in this state was effectively overriding the state legislators' desire to make gig workers employees with a proposition that basically undid that and said, no, they stay as contract workers. And when I mentioned Prop 22, I'm going to say I think Prop 22 is an incredible example of the dire sort of need for a specific institution, which is labor unions, really have to up their game and figure out how they are entering into this labor dispute. Having in prior years, particularly pre-2018, interviewed a lot of gig drivers, Uber and Lyft drivers, about their jobs. Big tech in the form of Uber and Lyft offer this seduction. It's hey, I'm not going to tell you what hours to work. And that's really appealing to a lot of people. It's very powerful. But then obviously they hide and facilitate the gross underestimation of what it actually costs drivers to do their jobs and you know, what they're actually making. So I feel like, you know, in big tech in particular, I do think we're seeing a shift in some newsrooms towards treating it a bit more like a labor beat. But like really, really, it needs to be so much more, considering how many jobs at this point, like how many people rely on like an app on their phone to figure out if they're going to be working on a given day and where they're checking into. I mean, it's like literally the next 10 years is going to be shaped by these gig jobs. And so how are we not much more aggressively covering the evolution of the gig economy? I don't understand.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, Aarti, like, you know, covering the big tech issues. I think that the vigorous and critical lens that we use these days to cover law enforcement need to be applied to coverage of the Silicon Valley. You cannot believe all the overriding narrative. You know, when the police call.
Prepare. The conversation was talking about labor. So I'm going to go and start off by saying the most invisibilized labor sector is that of migrants in our society. Yes. And bring it back to the stories about sort of the ICE kidnappings that happened at the beginning of the year that seem to have sort of left our attention with everything else that happened, and talk about that and sort of renewed questions about the carceral state, you know, the neglect at the ICE prisons, and how that's part of a larger conversation about the police state that we live in.
I'll jump in on this
Okay.
to say that it's a hope that I have. In the last 3.5 years, what we've seen.
Are we back on? I just wanted to make sure. I didn't know. Oh, we are. Sorry. Sorry. Okay.
What we've seen is an administration that is willing to basically take the letter of the law and be as cruel as possible with it. And I am very worried that the outrage over the treatment of migrants will fade away, because really it wasn't concerned about the treatment of migrants. It was, you know, sort of political football, which we see a lot of. And I hope that, you know, I'm interested to see what happens under President Biden, because during the very crowded, primaries among Democrats, they were very mealy-mouthed about the role of the migrant in American society. You didn't have candidates, by and large, not all, they didn't have a clear vision. And so what you heard was, you know, like, for example, when I would hear, you know, President-elect Biden talk about, you know, how migrant children were suffering at the border, what I wanted to know, what I wish I could have asked him is, and do you also believe that the people coming to this country are part of the lifeblood of this country? Do you think that's still true, or was it only true in the settler era when we were taking the land from natives? Is it still true? And if it's still true, can we finally have a migration policy proposal that reflects that? You know, like, it's fascinating to me about the migration debate is that when you talk to economists, there is, and they don't agree, economists disagree about everything, okay? But there is wide consensus among economists that the problem for the US is not too much migration, it's actually far too little migration. That is not a controversial thing to say. You know, I can give you an example of a great read that came out actually in 2019, Good Economics for Hard Times, written by the Nobel laureates in economics for that same year, this guy Banerjee and his wife Esther Duflo, Italian-Indian couple. And, you know, the fact is the US is an aging population. It's not particularly fertile. We could face the same crisis that Japan faced. And you have people who are willing to come to this country and work and frankly just become part of it. I mean, it's to migrate, it's such a risky thing to do. The people who do it, they're clearly motivated. And I remember speaking to these Nobel laureates, doing a brief interview with them one day, and they made the point, the greatest gift you can give a country is eager people. It's like, there isn't a better gift you can give a country. And so I would just love to see, now that we've been through, nearly 4 years of just like disgusting reality TV cruelty, right? Now that we've been through that, can we actually not just stop at this incredibly low bar of, yeah, we shouldn't do that to kids, but go back to some more fundamentals about, oh, we've been treating a population like there's some like leech on American society. And actually we've been gaslighting ourselves and them because they're a huge asset and we need to stop, being punks and speak honestly.
If I can make some comments about this migration thing, I'd like to put it in a broader context because yes, Trump has been almost terroristic in the way that he has dealt with the migration issue and the reality of people, especially from Central America, coming over here. But we're not the only country in the world dealing with this issue. The reality is that the world labor force is in motion. Wherever you go in the world, people are leaving certain countries as a result of dislocation or war or political troubles or just complete destitution. And the same problem is occurring in France, in Germany, in England, throughout Europe, Spain. All of them are facing the reality that migrants from the South, the global South, are coming in increasing numbers to their countries. They're usually coming to the very countries that were once their colonial masters, right? The reason there's so many Algerians, Tunisians, and Moroccans in France is because those were the colonies of France. The reason there's so many Jamaicans, Pakistanis, and Indians in the UK, because that was the colonial empire, the biggest colonial empire of Europe. And the reason there's so many Latin Americans in the United States is because Latin America was the birthplace of the American empire. It was the most reliable section where the empire drew wealth from. So people are coming, they're in motion, and globalized capitalism, which wants to break down barriers constantly for the flow of capital so that you can move your money and your investments in an instant, at the same time wants to erect barriers to the movement of labor. You can't do that. You cannot break down the barriers for capital while erecting barriers for labor. You cannot create an increasingly interdependent world while you insist that people have to stay in their own little cubicles. So the reality is that the very nature of globalized capitalism has forced people to be on the move, and then the wars that we create, the Syrians and the Afghanis and the Libyans. Look at all the Libyans that have fled since we intervened and deposed Gaddafi. So the reality is we create the problems, we dislocate these countries, and then we complain that the people leave. And we've got to be able to explain to the American people that the heart and soul of the migration problem in the United States is imperialism. It's nations dominating other nations. And we have to stop this. We have to convince the American people to oppose continued great power chauvinism around the world. If we do that, and if we let these countries develop and keep their own resources, I mean, right now, the United States is draining India and China of engineers and computer scientists because they can pay them, they can bring them here and pay them cheaper than they would pay the computer engineers that they would develop and the scientists right here in their own country. So that India is paying to school them, and then we're ripping them off to come to work in Silicon Valley. And that has to stop. We have to stop this process of continuing to dominate and exploit other countries.
And as an epilogue to what Juan and Aarti said, the reason there's such a lack of understanding or empathy on the when it comes to the experience and the traumas of the migrants or family separation is that we as journalists have not been able to tell their stories thoroughly and consistently, in part due to lack of access. You know, I know friends who cover immigration and who have negotiated with officials for weeks or months to get access to a family in detention or anywhere else in a federal facility, and then it unravels. You know, we expect to be able to document their struggles, and in the end, we aren't able to.
Yeah. Thank you both for wrestling with that. Actually, all three of you for wrestling with that question, because trying to think about this from a framework of empire and slavery together, I think really helps us understand the predicament of captivity and why it was that Black Lives Matter and, you know, the people who were fighting against the kidnapping of children were trying to keep that question of police power and state violence at the front of us. So we have really come up to the temporal, like the fundamental colonial temporality problem, right? Here we are, time is up for us. And there's all kinds of things that we wanted to talk to you about. We wanted to talk to you about the ecological devastation that's facing all of us, right? Yet another pandemic before the pandemic. We wanted to talk to you about so many other things, but grace calls us to do otherwise. And so I'm going to, on behalf of the panel, just say thank you and cede the ground to my colleague, Professor Judy Wu of the Humanities Center here at UC Irvine.
Thank you so much for the rich conversation, and apologies for that glitch. It's never happened to us before, so we need to figure out what happened there. There were some really beautiful questions that were posted in the Q&A, and unfortunately we lost them when we went off air. So I want to encourage everybody to repost if they have questions. Our program actually extends for another half hour. But we can also wrap up if people feel.
No. Thank goodness. I'm so happy that we still have time. Somehow I thought that we went until 6 o'clock. Man, this is excellent. That's really, really great. So I'm going to pose that question then that was the one I was headed to next. Thank you, Judy. Whew. Okay, so we were so dominated by COVID-19 that we probably missed lots of other stories of great consequence, particularly about ecological devastation, fires, hurricanes, storms, floods. The human toll of these has catalyzed the underreported massive farmer strike currently underway in India, Black farmers in the US who really fought against US policies. We've seen Afro-Americans in Carolina reclaiming much needed 100-year-old abandoned schools as community spaces and housing. What things like this or others should we have paid more attention to this year, particularly things like this that compel us as readers to understand how oppressed people all over the world are being affected by common problems, as opposed to the problems that get spun by our particular governments?
I think one obvious area is the increasing number of people in color who live homeless all across our nation, and indeed exploding in strength, in numbers in California. You know, it's only late in the pandemic that we started covering the day-to-day crisis of those abandoned on the streets, you know, who have not even any friends. We're not just mentioning family, but friends to follow, care for their progress. Another area I think is the inequities in education, something that's clearly coming to light when we see all of the children in virtual schooling and those that have to sit outside a McDonald's or a Taco Bell to be able to catch their Wi-Fi to log online and listen to their teachers talking. You know, that is absolutely devastating.
Yeah, I would also add that we're increasingly seeing the reality of climate refugees as a result of the climate crisis. The couple of 100,000 Puerto Ricans who were forced to flee the island after Hurricane Maria really created a whole new increased population in Florida, so that Florida now has, I think, more Puerto Ricans than New York State does, and increasingly, a lot of the Central American migrants are not just fleeing gang warfare; they're fleeing massive drought. They're fleeing a series of hurricanes. First, it was Hurricane Mitch back several years ago. More this year, it's a massive hurricane that created all kinds of devastation. We still haven't seen the results in terms of the migration as a result of that hurricane. So increasingly, the climate crisis, especially in some of these tropical countries, is fueling a new surge of migration. And just to get back to something that Aarti said about when she was remarking about the conservative trend in the Valley. I've spent a lot of time in the Valley years ago in Willacy County and Starr County, Cameron, Hidalgo, all those counties in the Valley. And the reality, I think, is that this turn toward conservatism among the long settled Mexican-American community of the Valley is in some part due to the militarization of the border, which has created enormous job opportunities that didn't exist. And there's double and triple the size of the Border Patrol. There's all the companies that are constructing the wall. Those are jobs that didn't exist before for an area that's very poor. And also there's an ethnic dimension, which is that the bulk of the refugees coming over now across the border are Central American. They're not Mexican anymore. And so there's no longer the tie between the Mexican-American community on one side and the Mexican community on the other, because these are now considered, oh, they're Guatemalans, or they're Hondurans, or they're Salvadorans. And so there's also, I believe there's an ethnic component to the lack of, to the shift in support of President Trump in the Valley area in specific because of those particular conditions. But the main thing is that the Central Americans that are coming are not just fleeing gangs and economic warfare, they're fleeing climate change.
That's an excellent point, Juan. Thank you.
Okay, as we wait for some of the questions to come back in, you guys have done a really great job sort of giving an outward conversation, but I want you guys to talk about yourselves as journalists, because some commentators have argued there's a role between the deregulation policy set forward by the FCC under the leadership of Michael Powell in the early 2000s, and as the right-wing movements have become more hostile towards reporters, the currency of the phrase fake news and the discovery of the phrase murder the media carved into a door during the riot in the Capitol. What have your experiences been in this climate? Have you feared for your own safety? Are there stories that may have been truncated because you could not have chased them down harder? So yeah, what do you guys think is the place of journalism today? Especially with the rise of social media as the outlet where people get their news, whether or not it's vetted and sourced, like you guys are held to that sort of criteria.
I've thought a lot about because the criticism of newsrooms, it comes from many places. It's evident on our call, on our event, as we criticize what we miss and how we cover certain things. There's the kind of, Donald Trump, oh, you're all fake news. And then there's, interestingly, if you read the memoir of his niece, Mary Trump, which is, I think, a fantastic read, she's really critical of the media because she's like, you guys made my uncle. Like, this wouldn't have happened without you, because you were chasing, I think, as Juan was noting earlier, these kind of shiny objects that we want to be, quote unquote, self-made, even though they're, tens of millions of dollars indebted to their rich daddy. But for me, so now I just want to shift to sort of a reflection on practice, because I am very skeptical of just criticizing and not doing something positive or proactive. And something that I've been concerned about in newsroom coverage is like, what are we? I mean, we're popular educators, right? Like we have a megaphone and we get to speak to, whether it's thousands or millions of people at a time, we get to speak to very large audiences. I keep saying speak because I do broadcast. And something that struck me is we are in an age of extraordinary activism. And it is in fact true that these things can go away if you don't cash in on them, institutionalize some of these changes. They really can go away. These moments, evaporate. But we're in an extraordinary moment. And I don't see sufficiently newsrooms or, magazines or just media outlets raising heroes. I mean, amplifying the stories of heroes. And I don't mean in stupid, like, listen, I use Instagram, but like, I don't mean in Instagram-y kind of ways. I mean like in nuanced ways and reported ways, in ways where you're actually learning how someone did something hard. And I worry, like when I speak for example, my nephew who's 21 lives with me. I speak to, as I speak to teenagers and people in their 20s, I think it's really like, they know they're getting a world worse off than the one we had. They know we're giving them something worse. That's not lost on them. And so they want to know, okay, how do I fix it? And so, the thing that I actually did is I quit my job covering Silicon Valley, and I actually started developing a new show, which I've just sold. So we're going to launch in March. It's called Art of Power. And Art of Power, every week, me, Aarti, brings you, the audience, a portrait, a deep dive portrait of somebody who actually figured out how to turn their passion into real world impact. And it's across industries, it's very diverse, it's global as well. And when I say across industries, I mean, like, we're gonna look at grassroots activists, like what exactly did Stacey Abrams learn from her mom and dad who were ministers that ended up translating into a Georgia political strategy? Also look to some extent at various businesses, creatives, artists, whatnot. But my intention in it is a bit of to put my money where my mouth or my criticism is, which is that if I'm concerned that people younger than me are going to have to do a whole lot to fix things. And I know, because before I became a journalist, I was a grassroots activist for a decade of my life, particularly in post 9/11 New York. And I can recall as a younger person having no clue how to affect change and feeling like I was creating the wheel from nothing and feeling a lack of mentorship. So I think that's something that's actually sorely missing in whether it's the newsroom or another part of what we do in our programming and our media, is meaningful, instructive stories about people who are actually fixing things that can inspire a generation to act, because they want it. They're asking for it, and we're not giving it to them quickly enough.
I think that sounds like a fantastic show. I can't wait to tune in. Yeah. Congratulations.
It's a co-production with WBEZ Chicago, which is, as you know, the creators of American Life. This Wait, Don't Tell Me. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. But yeah, I really hope, the point is to inspire a generation with knowledge, not BS.
I like what you say about not criticizing without offering the positives. And I am really grateful, first of all, that we're employed and that we continue to have a major platform on which to share our storytelling. Juan's point about the declining numbers of labor reporters, I see that and am thankful that at the LA Times, we do have a dedicated person covering labor really well, Margot Roosevelt. And in terms of coverage of everyday heroes, my colleague in the Metro section, Brittany Mejia, followed a hometown postal carrier for several days and wrote this lengthy lyrical profile on him, which went viral and generated, a Neiman Reports in-depth close look. How did she get that story? And we also have several people focus on covering day-to-day and the overarching themes of homelessness, as well as you know, the various levels of education from lower ed to higher ed, private schools, everything in between. What I think is that people mock the media. You know, at no other time in history under the current administration, we've been chased and cursed at and threatened and harassed at every turn, not just during crisis time, but day to day in our jobs. And last week at the insurrection, some people claimed in interviews with major reporters saying that, oh, we didn't break any laws. We were being citizen journalists by going to the Capitol and storming it. You know, so they invoke the privilege of being a member of the media when it might be convenient for them, and, you know, use the media at times as pawns. In other moments, they just resort to trite phrases like fake news. You know, we are in the media having to have riot training, and my colleagues who are covering massive protests have their own company issued riot gear, fire gear, everything else. And they're so dedicated in illuminating the news and explaining the day-to-day challenges for all segments of society. But, you know, again, it's just a constant barrier to overcome that sort of stigma that society labels us from time to time. Still, I love being.
If I could add some comments on this whole issue, I'll give you my take on media. First of all, I think that the media in the United States have a relatively privileged position compared to media in other countries in the world. In Colombia, in Mexico, in Iran, in China, and other places, it's a lot more dangerous job than it is in this country, number one. Unfortunately, the current crop of dominant media, especially in the major media people, really have not been through a whole lot in their lives, except those who actually went to cover the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, who actually did have to incur some major danger. But most of the journalists in this country have led pretty comfortable lives for the most part, if they're in mainstream media or they have a regular newspaper job. But I see the media really as there's three key what I call streams of the American media that are very different. There's what's commonly called the mainstream of the corporate media. And I spent 40 years working for mainstream newspapers and 29 years as a columnist at the New York Daily News. So, I mean, I know the world of mainstream media. But then there's the dissident media that has its own history throughout America, from the working men's press of the 1830s to the muckrakers of the turn of the century to the New Left press of the 60s. And I've been on Democracy Now! For 25 years now in February. So this is part of the dissident press in the American media. But there's another press that doesn't get as much coverage, which is the press by people of color. Because people of color were systematically excluded from both the mainstream media and the white dissident media for so long, they created their own press. You know, John Russwurm, Samuel Cornish, 1827, Freedom's Journal, the first Black newspaper in the world, and the Cherokee Phoenix, 1828, the first Native American paper, the first Latino papers in the 1820s. So we had to create our own press to be able to counter the narratives that existed in the mainstream and the radical press. Increasingly, though, as the country has become more demographically changed, press by people of color is dying. You know, the few Spanish language newspapers still left in the United States are controlled by Anglos, right? Telemundo is controlled by NBC Universal. You know, Univision is controlled by investment capital, Anglo investment capital. So no, people of color don't own their press anymore. The great Chicago Defender of the mid-20th century, or the Pittsburgh Courier, were the papers that African Americans read, and the Amsterdam News, because those were the papers that would tell them the story of what was actually going on in their communities. Those papers are shells, and most of them don't exist anymore. So I believe the main battle right now among journalists, especially journalists of color, is we have to break down the doors of social media companies, and we have to break down the doors of the investors who invest in new media startups. You have to diversify diversify the investment pool, so that those who invest in new media startups are forced to invest in African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans who have great ideas to own their own media outlets, not to work for somebody else. Right? And you've got to keep an independent people of color press alive in America while you seek to reform and have the mainstream press do better, you know, and keep after the dissident or radical press to be more multiracial. But we have to have our own independent press by people of color to always have a counter narrative to whatever the mainstream press misses. And that's a tough task, but that's what I've been working on all my life in terms of in my career, to work in all three: reform the mainstream media, you know, but build an independent media, an independent radical media, and an independent people of color media.
Yeah, thank you for adding context to that theme, Juan. I agree with you regarding the ethnic media, because while many of our counterparts in mainstream media had the luxury of working from home, the tiny staffs in ethnic media companies did not have that advantage and have been on the streets and in communities reporting almost every day.
Thanks, everybody. I want to add in response to Aarti's point before Salud about things that actually we do, you know, in addition to having really important, deep historical critiques. And they seem like really small things, but I find them to be not small at all. You know, Felix and I consulted with community radio journalists, podcasters, Black movement archivists, and I want to mention their names again, you know, Elizabeth Robinson, who has done programming for 45 years through World News Alliance and Ambark, Lynn Fujiwara out of Oregon, Steph Jones, Damian Sojourner, Jessica Millward, who's a professor and also a totally famous podcaster, like taught herself that in the middle of being a full-time academic, and Tommy Hayes. So this practice is consulting and bringing a crew. We don't ever walk into a room to have a serious conversation where we actually need questions just on our own steam. We have to have people that we're accountable to and that hold us accountable. So that's a kind of politicizing practice. I think that's really important and matters. And I'm really glad that you shared with us that you've had this big success, Aarti, because I think it'll enable, because you shared it here, it'll enable us to be back and forth in a dynamic conversation with you about how's it going, and you know, whether or not you're living up to what you said to us, what you meant the project to be. And so, you know, I feel like it's a huge invitation that you offer to all of us. I want to switch gears to a question from Isabel Gonzalez. Isabel writes, "Thank you to all the panelists for this wonderful talk. My question builds upon the question about stories that were underreported during 2020. The 2020 March for Black Trans Lives was one of the largest, if not the largest, organized protest in New York City's history. And yet coverage about Black and brown trans women is all but absent from mainstream coverage, even and especially when it comes to acts of anti-trans violence against non-celebrity trans people. Some would argue that this reinforces the disposability of Black trans lives. What is the role of journalism in creating a world where, to quote Black trans scholar C. Riley Snorton, Black trans lives will have mattered to everyone?"
Mm-hmm. Wow, what a great question, Isabel. Thank you. I think one of the obvious things that comes to my mind is that their voices would be able to have a wide platform in the editorial pages if they were so inclined to write first-person pieces and, you know, get that broadcast out there. These pages are looking, especially after Black Lives Matter launch, to increasingly diversify the opinion and op-ed pages, which have been so static for so long. Another thing is, I think this type of story could be really well told in video format for any kind of media company, whether it's a newspaper or television station, or, you know, even a hot blog, a news blog. I think seeing people, their faces, their passion, their emotion, their insecurities, as well as their confidence, and having that visual would really complement the voices that they're trying to get attention for, and to explain what their day-to-day life and the challenges are, the achievements, as well as the constant setbacks. Thank you for asking this.
Yeah, and I would agree that that much of the mainstream media does not or rarely pays attention to violence against Black trans folks. But we've had, at least in Democracy Now!, we've had numerous. I'm just looking back at some of the shows that we've done. On June 15th, 2 more Black transgender women are killed. Then January 16, Black Trans Lives Matter, the March for Justice of 15,000 people. We covered the police shooting of Tony McDade as well back in 2019. So we've done, at least in Democracy Now!, we've tried to stay on top of the epidemic of violence against trans folks throughout the United States.
And if I can just interject, when there was the glitch, we had our pronouns listed earlier on. And when we came back in the glitch, we didn't have a chance to repopulate them, just to show that we are aware and attuned to the needs of making this community feel seen and a part of the larger community that we belong to.
I just want to thank all of you for this incredible conversation. It was just so rich, and I'm so grateful for your activist work as journalists, that it's not just reporting the news, but really having a vision for a better society. I feel so fortunate to have heard your wonderful conversation and the fantastic questions from my colleagues. I want to thank all of you, and I also want to acknowledge the people who brought this program to you. Again, my apologies for that glitch. That has never happened to us, and I'm glad we were able to get back on. I especially want to acknowledge Ryan Gurney, who recently joined the UCI Humanities Center, and he's been such a stalwart of our programs, and he does it with such great cheer and support. We thought that he might not be able to be with us today, and I think reflective of our team ethos, several people stepped up. So Amanda Swain, who's the executive director of the UCI Humanities Center, Saeed Jalalapur, Joanne Jomora. And I think this ethos of collective care is something that we really need in our society right now. I encourage all of you to join our future programs for the Humanities Center. We have actually 3 next week that focuses on the concept of the Pacific world, and especially the Black Pacific, as well as the Indigenous Pacific. Thank you for staying with us, for participating in this rich conversation. And good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.